Hey guys, welcome to Thrive Bites Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Colin Zhu, and thank you so much for listening on. You could have been anywhere in the world and you decided to spend just a few moments of your precious time, and we greatly appreciate it. Here on the podcast, we talk about three things: living a plant-powered lifestyle, enhancing emotional resilience, and creating a thriving mindset. And I interview a range of passionate guests such as physicians, dietitians, coaches, entrepreneurs, and many more. And please join me as I deliver these engaging, informative, and high-valued conversations for you. And just remember, the first 5 seasons of the Thrive Bites podcast can now be found in the Chef Doc app, available in your Apple Store and Google Play stores. So what are you waiting for? Come on inside. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Thrive Bites podcast. I have the wonderful Christina Badaracco that's going to be with us today. She is a RDN, a nutritionist, a dietitian, a healthcare consultant, and an author. And we're going to be talking about unraveling the complexities of the Farm Bill. Why does it matter for the average consumer? Why does it matter for you as a healthcare provider? And how the Farm Bill dollar is spent and how that affects all of us. So you don't want to miss this, and stay tuned. Okay, guys. Well, welcome to another episode of Thrive Bites Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Colin Zhu, and thank you so much for being here with us. You could have been anywhere in the world, and you decided to stay here with us, share your precious moments with us, and we greatly appreciate it. Today, I have a wonderful, wonderful guest with us today, and I cannot wait to dive deeper into our topic. Her name is Christina Badaracco. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. She has a master's in public health, an RDN, and an LDN, and she is a healthcare consultant focusing on advancing the role of nutrition in healthcare and sustainable food production through evidence generation, education, and training of healthcare professionals and policy change. Until recently, she worked as a consultant at Valere, a healthcare advisory firm. She also regularly writes, teaches, and presents about nutrition, culinary medicine, and sustainable agriculture, including publishing the Farm Bill, a citizen's guide, publishing 5 cookbooks with Trans America Institute, and co-developing a culinary medicine course at the Georgetown University School of Medicine. And when she's not bored, she also does a culinary medicine shared medical appointment program for MedStar Shaw. As a renowned expert and thought leader in these fields, she regularly serves as a strategic advisor and guest speaker. And she also serves as the president of the DC Metro Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, a Slow Food DC board member, and other leadership roles. And she has earned her MPH from UC Berkeley and her bachelor's degree in ecology and evolutionary biology with a minor in Italian from Princeton University. So without further ado, please welcome to the stage, Christina. Hi.
Hi, Colin. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here with us. We are, very, very grateful and so happy to have you here with us on the show. Please tell the audience where you're calling from.
Sure. I'm in Washington, D.C.
Awesome. And what are we doing for the summer? Any bright plans? Please tell me you are traveling for leisure
I do have one trip coming up next week, going up to New York City, mostly to visit family, spend time with my little 2-year-old nephew, brother and sister-in-law. And then I do have a good friend out in California getting married in September. But overall, it's a fairly quiet summer, which is a really good thing because I think last spring and this fall, I have a ton of conference travel. So I'm actually really enjoying some quiet time to get out and, go to farmers markets and go hiking and just spend time here locally and enjoy the summer.
Yeah. We were talking off camera and how important work-life balance is. And as practitioners of lifestyle medicine, it's we got to practice what we preach, right? So including rest. So today I've had the great pleasure of having you at our member interest group MIG meeting for Food as Medicine, Culinary Medicine, speaking for a meeting, and have been able to hear so many great topics that you elucidate, break apart, unravel for us regarding the Farms Bill, right? And being able to understand from the lens of a consumer, as a citizen and being able to, like you say on your website, being able to connect the dots of food health and farming. And we want to be able to understand that. So before we get into that, I want you to share with our audience, what were the pivotal moments that help you reach your current roles today? I love sharing with our audience, the superheroine story, the origin from point A to point B. So how did you get to this point of your career?
I'd say I've had a very non-traditional career trajectory, but maybe you get that response a lot. So I definitely had not thought growing up, and even as of the time I graduated college, that I'd become a dietitian. I actually, for a very long time, wanted to work at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency here in DC. And for a while was thinking about going on to law school. I even started studying for the LSAT. And I ended up working at the EPA for a couple of years in the Office of Water. A lot of my work focused on nutrient pollution and the negative impacts on water quality, which are largely driven in this country by agriculture, among other sources. And for various reasons, decided I wanted to shift paths a little bit. And rather than focus on helping to promote environmental protection and sustainability through regulation, I decided to go back to grad school, focus in public health, and try to make a positive impact on the food system and on the environment more broadly through changing what we produce, what people have access to, what people are consuming. And initially wasn't even thinking about sort of the healthcare and nutrition side of things. But as I started to have informational interviews and volunteer in my local community and children's gardens and farmers networks and all of those, started to meet people who were bringing together the human and the environmental health, farm to school in the school district and teaching classes to kids and all of these things. And I thought, oh my gosh, these people are doing all the things that I love to do. I never realized these could be careers. And so I decided to go back to grad school, focus in public health and nutrition, also become a dietitian, even though I knew I didn't really want to work clinically for the most part. That was kind of the route I went. And then in terms of the more pivotal moments that you asked about, two really major areas in my career at the present moment, I guess kind of the two ways that you and I have now come together are through food and agriculture policy and culinary medicine. And both of those areas, I think I was really inspired to go into while I was at grad school, actually at UC Berkeley. The Farm Bill and Ag Policy, which we're mostly talking about today, came about through a connection while I was at Berkeley on campus. A local author, Dan Imhoff, was looking for someone to help him co-author his next edition of his book about the Farm Bill. And long story short, I was connected with him and we embarked on a multi-year project to conduct research and then publish the next version. And I've just been, teaching different audiences and looking for ways to help share this important information ever since. And then the other aspect is in culinary medicine, doing work with the Teaching Kitchen Collaborative and kind of doing work both locally and on a national level to help bring about improvements in health behaviors and dietary quality through teaching kitchens. And so I think that was sort of my connection to get plugged in with the MIG and ACL more broadly as well.
And thank you for painting that colorful road. When you've traversed so long, do you feel like you've been able to, because that's a very atypical route from, I have a lot of dietetic, friends, and it's a very atypical route, especially being non-clinical. How different and how satisfying has it been for you? Do you feel like in this route, it's been meaningful for you and it's been impactful for you?
Yeah. And I appreciate that. When I did my dietetic internship, I was based in a hospital. I was at Mass General for a year. I do see patients every now and then, both in terms of classes as well as individually. But I think my passion is really thinking a little bit more upstream and helping to support production of healthy food, consumption of healthy food, and enjoyment of healthy food so that people don't get sick and don't end up in the hospital in the first place. And so that's, at the end of the day, I think what lights me up inside and really excites me. So I think for the most part, yes, in answer to your question, I do feel like when you do more sort of policy level work or, population health level work, you do feel a bit more distant from people, the consumers and the patients. And so I wear a lot of different hats. I do a lot of different things in my career, even on a day-to-day basis. And, I think I'm still kind of learning how to do so in a way that promotes that work-life balance we were talking about. But I do find that I really get the most enjoyment when I have a mix of both, when I can see that I'm able to contribute to kind of the broader level change, whether that's through education or policy advocacy or writing or, training, whatever that might be, but also teaching classes or doing a little bit of one-on-one interaction with patients, because I can actually help bring about the behavior change. And I can see it. If I see one patient and see him or her again a few weeks later, I can actually see concretely some of those changes that I'm helping to bring about.
Totally understand the high level and, so to speak, the low level in terms of that one-on-one interaction, because you could be so disconnected when you're working at policy level, right? And implementing that affects a downstream effect. But when you're able to be on the grounds per se, right? And you're having that one-on-one conversation and you're, as an outpatient clinician, I, have those conversations every single day. And, I can fully imagine how meaningful it is in terms of really getting those just their qualms about food access and the food quality and being able to get X produce, and we don't have farmers markets, and food has traveled so much, and et cetera, being able to hear that it gives you a lot of meaning behind the words behind policy, right? There's like a depth of significance, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's get straight into it. You co-authored the Farms Bill, like you were talking about before, a citizen's guide. And let's break this down for our audience. What is the Farm Bill exactly? And what makes it challenging for the average consumer to understand? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, it's many, many pages, very verbose, very wordy. It's kind of like medical jargon, right? So why do you think it's been challenging for the average consumer to, understand it? And what exactly is it?
Sure. So the Farm Bill is our country's largest piece of food and agriculture legislation. It has been in existence for almost a century. We're coming up pretty close on a century, and each one lasts a certain number of years, typically about 5. So we reauthorize, or basically sort of create an updated version of the Farm Bill roughly every 5 years. For any of your listeners who are familiar with the WIC program or school lunch program, it's sort of similar in terms of how the child nutrition reauthorization is updated periodically. And so in the Farm Bill, we spend billions and billions and billions of dollars on a variety of different programs that support different aspects of food production and, I guess, sort of food dissemination. And so there are 12 different categories, or the official term is titles, of programs included in the Farm Bill. And what I think maybe a lot of people don't know is that by far the largest proportion of spending in the Farm Bill is the nutrition title. And the nutrition title refers specifically to nutrition assistance programs. So programs that are providing supplemental benefits, whether that's sort of in the form of a debit card or matching dollars or whatever it might be, to low income, low resource Americans. The largest program by far in that largest title is the SNAP program, or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance. But there are some others as well included in that title. The other largest 3 sets of programs, or largest 3 titles, include crop insurance, commodities, and conservation. So those are not for nutrition assistance, or rather not directly. Those are going to producers, to farmers, and have an impact on what's grown, how foods are grown, what the price of foods are. There are all sorts of implications, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more. So those are the 3 other biggest titles. And then there are another 8 that are much smaller. I talked a little bit about them in our MIG meeting before, but think of things like research through extension programs, looking at crop yield and nutrient content and other details like that. There's a title for some international aid. There's a title for, there's a miscellaneous title that includes support for, among other things, training for beginning and veteran and disadvantaged farmers. So a wide variety of different programs. And we'll, I'm sure, dig in a little bit more to the implications. But to answer your follow-up question about why is it so hard to understand? Well, I guess a main reason is it's massive in terms of dollars and number of pages. If I had to guess, I'd say the last iteration, signed into law in 2018, more than 1,000 pages. So it's not something that probably any lay audience member has ever read, and maybe even a lot of, members of Congress themselves, perhaps hopefully some staffers at least have read it in its entirety. But even if we haven't read it word for word, I think it's so important that consumers, as well as healthcare providers and farmers and other food industry stakeholders, at least have an understanding of what these programs are and what they're funding, so that we can either advocate for continuation of the same if we're supportive of the status quo, or if we're concerned about what we see and how these taxpayer dollars are being spent, well, then we can be important and active agents for change to support a better farm bill that works better for producers and consumers and everyone along the supply chain.
Now, you mentioned kind of like the top 3 and top 4, and I think you said nutrition is the biggest chunk of it. How is the percentages or allocations, determined?
That's a good question. So there's not a specific rule, at least as far as I'm aware. It's possible, there are, in terms of the House and Senate agriculture committees who are drafting the versions of these bills, they may go into it aiming for a certain percentage, but there's really, as far as I'm aware, not a hard and fast rule. In fact, the proportions have changed substantially over time. And actually, even stepping back further, the titles or these categories of programs have changed over time. So the conservation title, which I believe is either the 3rd or 4th largest now, was only added a few decades ago. It didn't exist before that. And the nutrition title has not always been the largest. In fact, really in the last, I think maybe decade or a little over a decade, it's been, at least like 3/4 of spending in the Farm Bill. So the proportions have not always looked like what we have today. And there are many reasons for why they've changed. If we look at nutrition, for example, a couple of drivers of increased spending have been increased demand during periods of time like the Great Recession. So when food insecurity goes up, demand for supplemental nutrition goes up. And then again, during COVID, food insecurity went up. A few years ago, we revised what's called the Thrifty Food Plan, which is the basis by which the level of SNAP benefits per family or per individual are determined. So it's sort of a basic package that is used to determine every person who participates how much money they'll receive. So that was revised to be increased because it had not been looked at in a long time. America knows with the effects of inflation and for other reasons, our food costs have gone up in recent years. And so a lot of people had been advocating for revision of that Thrifty Food Plan for a long time. So there have been many reasons that have led to the increase in spending. Also many factors contributing to the increase in spending for crop insurance and subsidies for crop insurance. And, I'd say a lot of reasons for that are influenced by lobbying and advocacy on the part of primarily large agribusinesses that want to keep receiving subsidies. So a lot of the very large companies that have very deep pockets are able to have a lot of influence in terms of the way these dollars are advocated, because it's in their best interest to keep receiving, the largest portion of the subsidies for production as well.
Yeah, I guess, in my, in my naivety, and let's just, paint a hypothetical picture, and I think about it through like an entrepreneurial lens, right? If we're using that as an analogy, is kind of like a return on investment, right? And so based off of that, you figure out, okay, what type of metrics you would have to utilize in order to say like, okay, is what we're allocating the best use of the dollar for said allocation, right? So I guess another way to ask this is like, how, what kind of metrics do they use? And I don't know how meticulous you want to be, but, it's just kind of like a high level, like, how do you determine that allocation and whether that dollar was worth spending, right? So.
Yeah, and that's a really good question whether we're talking about, direct healthcare applications or more in the food system. Of course, you and I would believe they're linked. That's why we're here today. And there's not an easy way to answer that question, I think, because as I was sort of intimating a few minutes ago, different parties have very different interests. And so we could think about farm worker welfare. We could think about, like retention of land. An issue I know I talked about a little bit in our meeting a couple months ago was that we currently have a shortage and a declining population of farmers in this country. Mm-hmm. So we're really struggling as a country to figure out how do we make sure we have enough people working in this industry to feed Americans moving forward. So thinking about just number of farmers and what does the age structure of farmers look like? If we think a little bit more squarely around food access, looking at factors related to what's the prevalence of food insecurity in this country, and gosh, how is it distributed across the country? I think a lot of people are really surprised to understand better that even in a lot of the agricultural communities of this country, food insecurity is a major problem. Mm-hmm. A lot of that is because a lot of the food that they're growing doesn't even end up in the food supply. Or if it does, it's very processed ingredients like corn and soy that are, not really nourishing them. So food insecurity. And then what about diet-related outcomes? Obviously you and I know how much we as a country spend on treating diet-related diseases. I don't think we as a country, or at least, from Congress's perspective, have really thought about what are the health outcomes in terms of dietary intake? Even maybe thinking of factors related to, exposure to chemicals and other things like that through our food production. Mm-hmm. And maybe should we think about shifting the way we spend our dollars to improve the health outcomes so that we don't have to spend so much on healthcare as a country, not to mention quality of life and all of the other related factors. So a lot of ways of answering your question, but I think that there are just, so many different parties have different interests, that there's not one key set of metrics.
I was definitely not anticipating a straightforward answer. I know that, answer would be so convoluted, like a, plate of spaghetti, if we're going to use food analogies. One of the biggest things that I took away from the previous MIG meeting, and I want you to reiterate for us audience that wasn't a part of it, and that kind of goes along with my next question, is the young farmers, that short supply of young farmers. That was one point that was really surprising to me in our country now. And then how much fruits and vegetables we actually import as opposed to, grow ourselves. Do you mind highlighting those 2 points for our audience?
Yeah. And I really appreciate that you asked because, I guess every point that we talked about in our group and that we're talking about today, I do think it's so important for healthcare providers to understand all of this because it impacts what people are eating, people's health outcomes, et cetera. And I think, factors related to how many fruits and vegetables we produce as a country, what we're importing, who's going into farming. I'm guessing a lot of healthcare providers think, that's not directly related to my work, but really it is, because for so many reasons. Some of our patients are agricultural workers, right? So we do need to care about their health, but also the less nutritious food we're able to produce as a country, the more and more reliant we are on importing from other countries. And that's concerning for issues related to a secure food supply. I don't think we even talked in that meeting, but I've read in recent months too, thinking about, different chemicals that certain countries are able to use in agriculture. So I read an article looking at pesticide residue from domestically produced versus imported types of produce, and how for almost all types of produce assessed, there was a much greater pesticide load when imported from other countries. And, I'm sure if you could dig in more, you would find it varies by country. I'm sure some are stricter than others, but that's important for health implications as well. So to answer your specific questions regarding, well, maybe I'll just start with the sort of food importation side of things. And this is fairly new to me as well. I learned some of this information, a wonderful group called Farm Action, several months ago, I think. It was actually suggesting we as a country for the last couple of years have had a major agricultural trade deficit. So we are really more reliant than ever before on imports of food from other countries. And that's really largely driven by fruits and vegetables. So we are, and I believe at this point, we are importing about 2/3 of fruits and vegetables that we eat in this country from other countries, all over the world. Probably a big proportion of that is like Mexico and Central America, but we see a fair amount even from Europe. And so it's coming from all around the world. I'm not necessarily against trade. That's not my point here today, but for many reasons, whether it's trying to minimize transportation and energy use or, promote more sort of sustainable production methods or just helping to keep family farmers in business in our own country. I think it is really important to be able to support that domestic production, ideally even more than domestic, like regional and local production. So I do think it's concerning that so much of the food that we're eating now is coming from other countries. And I don't think most people are aware. Again, as of a year ago, I was not even aware. And
I'm just going to pause. That worries me so much because, even to that point of just the pesticide residue, right? I mean, it's from a clinical point of view, we don't talk enough about that food connection and nutrition, right? And then you add another layer of, okay, is this going to be toxic for me and not? And I get lots of questions of, should I eat everything organic, right? And things like that. And I teach them it's important to buy produce closer to home and to be in farmers market, shake hands with your local farmer, have that relationship so you can reinforce and understand that connection. And to hear that, roughly about 2/3 is importing in. And I'm like you, I'm not against trade as well. But at the same time, it's like, if we're able to produce this within our own lands, like, why not, right? Like, what are the behind the scenes forces or decision making that's creating this type of deficit?
Yeah. And I think this topic and my answer to this question sort of relates to your other question before about what's going on. Why do we have a deficit of young farmers? And I think a major reason is it's right now in this country. So there are so many barriers to becoming a farmer and then earning a living and being able to stay a farmer. So if we look at who most, I guess, sort of the age structure of who's in farming right now. I believe last I checked, the average age of a farmer in this country was in the 60s, approaching retirement age. We don't have enough young people entering the field. When we look at who's getting most of the subsidy dollars through the Farm Bill, we see that most dollars are going toward the biggest farms that already have the most wealth. So we're kind of helping the large wealthy farms to get bigger, consolidate more, get wealthier. And then the young farmers, the beginning farmers, those especially who want to grow crops that are not receiving as many subsidy dollars. Think of the fruits and the vegetables, the nuts and legumes, a lot of the foods that we're probably suggesting fill most space on people's plates, right? There just relatively speaking, there aren't a lot of supports for those producers. And there are so many barriers to getting into practice. And we know that even across age groups, more and more farmers are reliant on off-farm income. So they're having to work multiple jobs, sometimes even work full-time off the farm. And then, farming is what they do outside of their 9 to 5, just to be able to make ends meet. They do it because they're passionate about it. So there are just so many barriers that are preventing people from going into this field. And I think these are sort of related issues that are at the same time reducing the number of farmers in this country, and also these biggest farms that are producing primarily commodity crops. When I use the word commodity, I'm referring to things like corn and soy and wheat and sorghum and canola,
Which I believe you said takes up, I think correct me if I'm wrong, the meeting that we talked, you said it takes up literally 75% of the supermarket.
Probably more than that, in terms of subsidy dollars. Yeah. But we're using so much of our available farmland for those crops. A lot of them, as I mentioned before, don't even directly end up in our food supply, like corn, so much of it ends up in ethanol. A large proportion of both end up in livestock feed, very cheap livestock feed, rather than in food to actually nourish people. So then again, we're not producing enough fruits and vegetables to meet demand of Americans. Another related issue, as we know, is Americans are not even eating as many fruits and vegetables as we're recommending them to do, but we're not even meeting current demand. And so we're having to import just to meet the low demand we have now. So that's the state of things.
Yeah, I'm just like trying to wrap my head around it because, like on one hand, like you said, I think the latest stats, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was like 90%, one out of every 10 Americans meet their recommended servings, right? So you have 90% that are not, 97% are deficient in fiber. And, so I'm like thinking, what came first? Is it because you have the low production that's not producing enough fruits and vegetables to be able to meet the suggested, recommended servings, or vice versa? Like what came first, or did they happen by separate processes?
It's a good question. And gosh, I'm sorry, Colin, again, I don't think there's an easy answer. I think it's both. I think it's both directions because we've seen some of these discrepancies between what Americans are eating and what we're recommending for a long time. The Farm Bill, as I mentioned before, we've had a Farm Bill for about 90 years by now. The first was signed into law in 1933. So we're coming up on a century, but we did not by any means, even 80, 90 years ago, we're not allocating the enormous amount of subsidies that we are today. So we've definitely skewed over time and increasingly skewed what's being produced. So I do think that discrepancy has gotten worse, but I think that there, as you know, there are many factors outside of what we're subsidizing that are affecting what people eat. I would probably argue that all of these factors are related. But when we think of factors like marketing, what a lot of the very large food companies are marketing, maybe it's on TV targeted at children, what we see in the aisles at large grocery stores. So there are just many factors that are influencing that discrepancy between what people are eating and what we're recommending. And I think some of that is driven by, these sort of market distorting subsidies in a way. And they're, I guess, unfortunately, feeding off one another to drive those gaps.
It's definitely, we're not feeding off of. I mean, we are feeding off of it. All the stuff that is not nourishing and nutritious for us, and it's feeding off, in my opinion, pockets of deeper interests. That's how I would look at it. Before I go on to the next topic, is that whole young farmer and that low supply. It has, in a way, that's almost like a parallel to our industry, where you don't have enough primary care physicians, right? And in lifestyle medicine, we believe in the preventative model. We believe in the proactive track, because we live in this kind of corporate healthcare machine and thrives off of the reactive, mode setting. And so it's very interesting how that almost parallels, you just don't have enough people at the front gate to be able to recommend. I mean, half of my practice, I'm board certified in family medicine. And so we do, total primary care where I work, but I focus a lot. Half of my visit is literally focusing on how to get people to eat nourishing foods, move better, all the pillars of health, whereas some of my colleagues who didn't receive that training, whether it's in, medical school or getting it afterwards through organizations like lifestyle medicine, they don't spend that time. They don't have that awareness. They're not as confident, which surveys have shown. And so we're not talking about it. Right. And so awareness is key. So, I'm glad that we did bring up that young farmers, and I hope that there's a, more of like an awareness or public campaign of, being able to incentivize more. That needs to change. It sounds like, if I were to ask your opinion. So.
Yeah. And I love that parallel that you pointed out. And I do often, when I speak to healthcare audiences, make sort of a quick comment, like we're all experiencing in primary care. And I'd even say now dietetics and nursing, so many types of healthcare providers. We do have a shortage, but I like that you sort of took it one step further and tied it back to the payment structures, because we know that like payment differentials is a big contributor in addition to burnout and other factors, why we see more people going into specialties rather than primary care. And I think that adds a little more nuance to what I'm talking about in agriculture, like with a lot of the subsidies driving farms to get bigger and wealthier and impeding smaller beginning farmers, producers of a lot of these truly nourishing foods from getting into it. So I think that really actually paints a very nice or very clear picture. I don't know if I should say that.
Yes. We're all about high level here. So. Hey guys, don't forget there's a part 2 to this. Stay tuned. Hey guys, we hope you enjoy that episode. If you like that, please like, comment, and subscribe. And please follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, and anywhere that you listen to your podcasts. And if you felt that this was a benefit for someone else, please let them know. And also remember that the first 5 seasons, 150 episodes, now can be seen and heard on our new The Chef Doc app. And don't forget to give us a 5-star rating, and we greatly appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next one.